secret love child. Writer Mariel Daniels, then a 16-year-old working on a biography of the Belgian Queen Paola in 1999, casually discovered, the then reigning King Albert II fathered an illegitimate daughter during an affair that lasted 18 years. Casual stuff, you know. She was born Delphine Bowles in 1968, daughter of Baroness Sybil Delcilius Longchamps, and from an early age, Delphine did know who her biological father was. Albert, who she nicknamed Papillon, was a constant presence in her childhood, even taking her on holiday. Though apparently an open secret in royal circles and the reason for marital troubles between the king and the queen, the story only became publicly known in 1999. Delphine had been speaking with Albert her whole life up to this point, who then reassured her that it would just blow over. But then in 2001 his tone changed. He told Delphine he wasn't her father and broke off their contact, leaving her in a state of shock. She eventually launched a legal action to secure recognition in 2012, but it dragged on for years as Albert continued to deny paternity. But when he stepped down from the Belgian throne in 2013, he lost legal immunity, so off to court they went. And it was only in 2020, after court-mandated DNA tests proved irrefutably that the former monarch was the father of artist Delphine Bowles, Albert was finally forced to acknowledge he'd fathered a child out of wedlock 51 years prior. And when it comes to siblings, you know what a big deal it is to say, "I call dibs"? William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of England, had 4 sons. One died before him, but William split his kingdom between his remaining. Robert, who was given Normandy, and William, who was given the whole dang throne of England. That left the youngest Henry just cold hard cash. William consoled Henry with the prediction that he would one day amount to much more than either of his siblings, who proceeded to make his life hell, stealing from him and locking him away routinely. Then in 1100, William, the older brother, dies in a hunting accident. Henry didn't even bring the body back. I'm not kidding, he got on his horse and he went around and galloped to secure the royal treasury in Winchester before rushing to London, where he was crowned on the 5th of August 1100. He was king before Robert, returning in triumph from the First Crusade, even knew the crown should have been his. Robert attempted to take England for himself, but Henry beat him back, and then after a few years took Normandy too. Robert was captured and Henry kept him in prison for the rest of his life. Henry ruled for 35 years in total and lost his only heir to the sinking of the White Ship, causing a royal succession civil war called the Anarchy. And speaking of dysfunction, it's the crappy Castiles. Born 4th in line to the throne of her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, Juana was married off to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy at age 16. When a series of sibling deaths made her the heir apparent to Isabella's throne, her husband confined her, using her mother's death in an attempt to press his claim over Ferdinand's for the Castilian throne. Juana already experienced mental illness before this point, and the loss of her mother had been an aggravating factor. Being imprisoned? Yeah, that does not help. After Philip's death in 1506, already known to fly into jealous rages over her husband's mistresses, even reportedly going so far as to attack at least one. Honestly, same energy here, girl. Juana refused to part with her deceased husband's remains for a disturbingly long time and was said to have opened her husband's casket to embrace and kiss him. Juana's confinement continued for another decade after her father's regency until he died. Unfortunately, Juana's husband Philip had spread rumors about her madness when he was still alive, and her behavior after his death didn't help, so her son Charles, who became the Holy Roman Emperor, eventually took over for Juana as regent and then monarch. From then on, it was him who kept her imprisoned and created a fictional world to keep her isolated. No one actually knows if she was crazy or just experienced depression and lived in an era where men undermined her intelligence and constantly threw distressing BS her way. Next up is 2 sets of dirty duos. The extreme punishment of a perceived disgraced royal woman stretches back at bare minimum to, dawn of time. Yeah, we haven't had a lick of peace since men started making rules, to say the least. In 1314, the high-spirited Marguerite and Blanche of Burgundy, daughters-in-law to King Philip of France, were accused of having scandalous liaisons with 2 brothers, Philippe and Gaultier d'Aunay. According to historian Alison Weir, the notorious Queen Isabella of England was the gossip girl who outed her pretty careless sister-in-law's out-of-wedlock romps, which took place primarily in the Parisian tower called Tour de Nesle. Blanche and Marguerite both admitted to their adultery because it was that or death, so I mean, their erasure from public life was swift. They had their heads shaved and they were tossed in the rich white girl dungeon, which isn't that bad. Meanwhile, this is the one time in Western history where the men actually faced a pretty harsh adultery consequence, something usually found in every other area of the world. The brothers had their elephant trunks and boys chopped off while they were awake and alive, and then their nether regions were thrown to dogs, which they had to watch the dogs eat before being brutally executed. Marguerite, technically Queen of France upon her husband's ascension to throne, died in 1315, and Blanche languished in captivity, whereabouts barely known, and died in 1326. Modern-day monarchy wouldn't be complete without a tax fraud family. 2014, the dubbed philandering playboy king Juan Carlos of Spain found his popularity plummeting. His initial ascension to throne in 1975 had been wondrous, but now following reports of his messy affair and exuberantly lavish lifestyle in the midst of Spain's economic collapse, he abdicated the throne in favor of his son Felipe. His daughter Infanta Cristina stirs the pot, charged with tax fraud in 2014. Although she was acquitted in 2017, she was stripped of her title and left Spain for Switzerland. But it was her husband's turn, I guess, because the former handball champion was convicted on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and tax evasion and sent to prison in 2018. Since then, Spanish prosecutors launched 3 separate investigations into the former king over allegations including corruption, money laundering, credit card fraud, and kickbacks, though all were dismissed earlier this year due to insufficient evidence, the statute of limitations, and of course the monarch's constitutional immunity. In a recent case, Seguin Wistin has sued him for using Spain's spy agency to threaten her, and in 2020 he was stripped of his Spanish stipend and went into self-exiled in the UAE. First, the great-grandmother, an imprisoned princess. Starting in 1682, Princess Sophia Dorothea of Saly married the basic B-word George of Hanover. She didn't like him, his stupid court, or the mistress that dominated his life, so in 91 she starts her own affair with Philip Christoph von, hard last name, it sounds super Scandinavian. They're naturally very stupid, and their love letters get intercepted by Clara, Countess von Platen, who was Sophia's literal mistress-in-law, and Clara tells the whole royal family, who act like a mob and hire 4 dudes to kill Philip right outside of Sophia's apartment, in her line of sight. Then they took Sophia's kids away and told them to forget her existence. They imprison her at Alden House in Germany, and to save face, Sophia Dorothea is titled a duchess, allowing her to administrate over a small village, receiving dignitaries and other religious figures in her gilded cage, although she was only allowed to walk or ride on short bits of the road. It's said that the notorious hateful relationship between George I and his son George II was the cause of the disrespect towards his mother Sophia. She had died at Alden House in 1726, largely forgotten, and her legend would only resurface a few decades later due to a scandal that swirled around her great-granddaughter, Catalina Matilda of Great Britain, the sister of King George III. Now, the great-granddaughter, Queen of Tears. In 1766, at the age of 15, the daring and eccentric Catalina Matilda is married to cousin King Christian of Denmark, who suffered from being a massive insipid turd who grew up with untamed anger management and insecurities that made him into a deranged bully as an adult. Christian treated Caroline exactly how you would imagine from that description. He even delayed consummating their union for years, which is wildly unheard of. She traveled alone, no maids or family or rich folk stuff, to Denmark from England, and no one even told her he was a nutcase who would hate her. Yeah, no, by 1770 she was having her own affair with Johan Friedland Struensee, and the two lovers soon scandalized Europe by essentially taking over Denmark, issuing reforms and infuriating the nobility. Caroline Matilda was riding high, striding through the court in men's clothing, subverting the patriarchal codes of the day. In 772, Denmark's Queen Juliana Maria orchestrated a palace coup, and the increasingly tyrannical Johan is executed in April. Catalina Matilda is banished and disgraced. Her unacceptable conduct convinces her brother George that he could not welcome back this criminal sister into the English royal family. Ripped away from her children, she is sent to Celle Castle in Hanover, and like her great-grandmother, put under a sort of Gentile house arrest. Unlike her great-grandmother, she is allowed to walk through town, earning praise from commoners for her kindness and charity, because it doesn't count as a crime if he did it to himself. Most of the information we have about Crown Prince Sado, born in 1735, comes from the wife's autobiography, Queen Hayejeon, written in 1805. She recalled what happened as his disease progressed. Prince Sado's mental health further deteriorated by 1757, following the death of the Queen and his adopted grandmother. To release his emotions and frustrations, Sado began to beat the court eunuchs and staff. When that wasn't enough, he began to kill. Here's what his wife's account was of that. The first person he killed was Kim Hachia, the eunuch who happened to be on duty that day. The prince came in with the severed head and displayed it to the ladies in waiting. The bloody head, the first I ever saw, was simply a horrifying sight. As if he had to kill to release his rage, the prince harmed many ladies in waiting. I suffered so for this. His illness seeped deeper and deeper. Now that he was killing people, our quarters became a house of horrors, in which no one could be certain that they would not fall victim next. Eventually, Prince Sado kills his favorite mistress and threatens his own sister. In 1762, realizing the disgusting conduct would ruin the Korean family, his mother appealed to his father and they had to eliminate their own child. Since tradition dictated that his wife, Lady Hyajong, would have to die as well as their son if they punished Prince Sado, the king came up with a bizarre solution to safeguard the daughter-in-law and heir. On a sweltering day in July, the king forced Sado to step into a rice chest that would then be locked. So that way, technically, the disgraced prince had caused his own death. He died 8 days later. And I can't even give you a funny title for this one because it's just a lot. This is the crop top king. King Maha of Thailand, crowned in 2019, is a philandering train wreck hot mess. When his third wife dumped him, he tossed her parents in prison for 2.5 years for royal defamation. His earlier 2 marriages were equally rocky. He allegedly fathered 5 children with a mistress during his first marriage to his cousin, and then married said mistress. Later he dumped her and made her flee the country. When he was crowned prince, taking a page from Caligula, he appointed his pet poodle Fufu to the royal air chief marshal, then held 4 days of Buddhist funeral rites when the poodle died in 2015. He even took the pooch to a 2007 reception hosted by His Honor the US Ambassador Ralph Skip Boyce. Then there is the 70-year-old king's fondness for wearing crop tops and temporary tats. Check out this sick pic at an airport in Munich, strutting his stuff with a rolled up tank top, sagging jeans, and fake tattoos with the poodle in tow. Call this king a queen cause he is serving! Belly-bearing vests have become the garment of choice for many young Thai pro-democracy protesters in rallies in recent years. They are looking to limit the powers of the king who has become the richest monarch in the world, partly by amassing personal control of an estimated 43 billion in royal assets in 2018 that were historically overseen by an agency meant to manage the money for the benefit of the Thai people. His response for this was to ban crop tops. In July 2019, 2 months after the king married his 4th wife, his longtime mistress Siniat was made a royal consort in hopes of getting her to shut up and accept that he'd never marry her and make her queen. 2 months later, because this didn't work, he strips her of her titles, tosses her in jail until she can learn to behave, and after 10 months, she's released back to his custody for about 2,000 explicit images of them to get leaked to the entirety of the Thai community in a cyber attack, and everyone sees these guys. They're explicit. Obviously, I could keep talking about this guy and his gross scandals forever. There's no shortage of them, but instead, we'll stare at these airport photos again because man, what the hell am I seeing here? We're gonna start with a classic, the Death House Landlady. Social workers in the 1970s looked up upon Dorothea Puente and her boarding house with admiration. Puente had a reputation for taking in people considered tough cases, recovering alcoholics, addicts, the mentally ill, the elderly. And she was so sweet looking too. Aw, look at the little cardigans, cute cottage house. Well, psych, you guys. Puente spent her youth being a huge piece of human garbage, abandoning any children she had, getting out of jail, others, so naturally, she opens a boarding home, which she loses spectacularly fast after getting caught signing her own name on her tenants' benefit checks. In the 1980s, she worked as a personal caretaker who drugged her clients and stole their valuables very Cardi B style, so she got sent to prison. Then she said round 2 and opened another boarding house. This would be the Death House. For years, the disappearances went unnoticed, even by their probation officers. Puente's cute old lady gimmick and some wicked scone recipes was her meal ticket to getting away, but eventually, like all killers, the wrong person goes missing eventually. While a tenant at first backed up Puente's usual lie that the person had left on vacation, he slips a note to the police before they left saying it was untrue. So they asked permission to do a little landscaping, dig up the yard. Puente's all like, yeah, of course, why not? Here, even take this extra shovel, get to digging. Then she asked if she would be okay to go buy a coffee. They said yes, because she's an 1,000-year-old lady. What could she possibly do? She dipped, they find 7 bodies, and Puente finds herself a sunny vacation in Los Angeles on the lam for 5 days when police catch her before she can Mary Poppins herself away again. She received multiple life sentences. I love a sustainable gift, but this? Thrifting and gifting done wrong. It's 1861, and Mary Pichon is looking for work that doesn't require her having womanly assets. Luckily, she meets a kind man whose intentions seem genuinely good, hearty work for her, and so she lets him lead her into the woods. Oh, you see where horror movies get their inspiration. People really go, okay, and then prance on after inevitable danger, and it's danger Mary meets once the guy attacks her. Mary, who somehow manages to escape, runs for her life as he chases her through the woods all the way to a nearby village, and she tells authorities, who promptly go find him. When they find him, they find 2 bodies and piles of female clothing inside of his property, bloodstained and torn, which didn't bother Miss Drummelard at all, who's just been out here wearing this clothing. And yes, homegirl knew her husband was ripping them off of the women he was killing. The clothes, by the way, implied hundreds of women had died on their property. Drummelard was found guilty of 6 murders, and they chopped his head off in 1862, which by the way is a way better fate than his daddy, who was part of the plot to kill the King of Austria and got ripped apart by ponies. His wife, meanwhile, got 20 years for running around in dead people clothes. Let's meet a crazy nun who put back on everything. 15th century Milan. This is where Mariana di Levea Marino was born to a wealthy banker who dumped her on her aunt and took off. He remembered she existed at 13, long enough to force her into a convent in Monza. Now a nun, she did pretty aight. She was a role model, did stuff diligent-y, very Jesus-y. I don't know what nuns do. I do know that in her 20s, she fell for an aristocratic womanizer, which is hella out of character for a nun. Gianosio and Marianne were sinning it up all over the place. He had a blacksmith make keys to the convent to sneak in, and they even had secret kids, but Marianne alternated between gratifying her lust or just guilt-tripping over that sin. So in her brain, to try and make herself hate him, she started eating his feces. It did not work. His feces hit the fan when a nun threatens to whistle-blow the affair, so Osseo smokes her. Then, to cover their tracks, since rumors started about a missing nun, they decide to kill more people. Osseo kills the blacksmith, while Marianne deals with an apothecary that supplied her some anti-baby herbs once. Yeah, it didn't work. Governor of Milan sits everyone down in a torture chamber and says, let's talk this out. Osseo manages to sneak away and he's sentenced to execution absentia. Marianne, meanwhile, gets bricked up in solitary confinement for 15 years until she's a hollow empty shell and they let her out to live out in a convent. The end. Fairy tale romance. She's known by many names, but I will introduce her as the Bloody B word. And the most prolific serial killer of the Western world, Elizabeth Bathory was niece to Stephen Bathory, head of the eminent Hungarian family and Prince of Transylvania, who later even became the King of Poland in 1575. She was married to Count Nastasy, and they lived at Karachin Castle in the Carpathian Mountains, now Slovakia, in the 1600s. Okay, what else? Oh yeah, she practiced vampirism because this is Transylvania and everything's a joke, I guess. She is alleged to have killed more than 650 women with the help of 4 servants, specifically those with qualities such as great beauty, intelligence, strength, etc., in order to drink their blood and bathe in it. Her reasoning for this was to preserve her youth and beauty. Word was beginning to spread about her sadistic activities. At first, victims were servants in her castle, then they were daughters of local peasants, and later they included girls sent to her by local gentry families wanting them to learn good manners from a deranged Twilight fan. When her murderous career was discovered, the Countess was walled up in her castle from 1610 until her death in 1614. She's also the inspiration for the famous sapphic female Dracula counterpart, Carmilla. Before I go crazy, tell me I'm pretty. So, from 1971 to 72, police officers were having a bit of an issue. Super weird, creepy graveyard crimes. Someone had been exhuming corpses from their graves and interfering with them, which we all know is code for they are a perv. They had 5 bodies on their hands that had been tampered with, even chewed on a little, and some showed signs of adult activities having transpired. Then on the flip side, May 6, 1972, a young couple is found killed in their car. That crime's different. Why connect them? The female body showed evidence that the killer had been trying to drink her blood like a big gulp and had done more gross stuff. Later, the same thing happens to a lone woman with the same posthumous rituals. Then, a mortuary worker is just trying to do his literal job and walks in on someone locking lips with a cold cadaver, who proceeds to freak out on being caught. Not great, since he had a weapon. Mortuary worker survives his wound and eventually identifies Kuno Hoffman as his attacker. Hoffman confesses to everything, no hesitation, the graveyard creeping and the killings. His motivations had to be explained through a translator. Kuno had undergone extreme treatment as a child and was now mute and deaf. After a previous prison sentence, he turned to the occult for solace. Studied from Satan books and got in his head if he did some weird stuff to corpses, he could become handsome and popular finally, that people would like him. Kuno Hoffman was confined to an asylum for life, and while his backstory is not an excuse for his actions, it is an explanation. situation. So a reminder that sometimes treating others with kindness can make all the difference in the world. How about some recent history to remind you these people aren't solely of the past? The Westfield Watcher. Derek and Maria Broadus filed a lawsuit in the Union County, New Jersey, alleging that their home's former owners had failed to warn them about a local individual who calls him or herself the Watcher. Are they a neighborhood gossip rag? Maybe an old coot who can't mind their business. Maybe a neighbor who leaves passive-aggressive notes. Wrong, wrong, and wrong. In 2015, one of the strangest cases in modern history appeared when a letter was mailed to the new owners of a home. Dated June 4th, 2014. You can find the transcripts of these lawsuits online, and they do contain the letters, so I figured, why not directly read some for you guys? Alright, so here's some fun lines from letter 1. The house has been subject of my family for decades. I have been put in charge of watching it and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, my father watched the house in the 1960s, it is now my time. The Watcher also asks the couple, do you need to fill the house with young blood, I requested? Remind me to ask for young blood as a new housewarming gift, in case I don't know, I might need that. Second and third letters were also just as deranged. Listen to this. Have they found what's in the walls yet? In time they will. Who has the bedroom facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. It will help me know who is in which bedroom, then I can plan better. All of the windows and doors in 657 Boulevard allow me to watch you and track you as you move through the house. No information on who the Watcher might be or why they sent out the letters has come to light. Letters contain implication, however, that this person's lineage once owned and dwelled in this home. The entire Broadus family has vacated the house in fear of their safety, but who will buy it next? Believe it or not, his head is on display in Ripley's, Wisconsin. The Vampire of Dusseldorf. Also known as Dusseldorf's monster, Peter Kürten killed at least 9 people in 1929, Dusseldorf, Germany. Alright, so firstly, what made him so difficult to catch was he kept changing MOs. Not to freak you guys out, but historically this works incredibly well for police evasion and is the reason we have so many uncaught, unconnected cases today. Sometimes he used scissors or a hammer or his bare hands. Eventually when he is caught, it's due to a postal mistake. See, Maria was nearly a strangulation victim of Kürten's on May 14, 1930. She didn't report the police, but she wrote about it in a letter to a friend, and the letter she addressed incorrectly. Because of the incorrect address, a clerk at the post office opened it, read it, went, what the hell, and forwarded it to the police, who then found and interviewed Maria and said, yo girl, we got something we need to talk about. She said the reason Kürten had let her go is she told him she couldn't remember his address, where he'd taken her before taking her to the woods. Yeah, no, she remembered it just fine, to the point she said, grab your coats, boys, let's go for a little walk. Kürten was arrested and found guilty of 9 killings and 7 attempted. He was executed by guillotine on July 2nd, 1931. Then weirdly, his head is dissected and mummified and now displayed at Ripley's, believe it or not, in Wisconsin. If you're kosher like me, you have to worry about what's in your food. But for those who ate at Carl Grossman's cart, they really had to wonder, what's in a hot dog? The last name Grossman really suited him because even before he rented his greasy slum house in the 1920s Berlin, Grossman was packing a rep sheet of some seriously wonky criminal charges. And apparently, despite that, no red flags went off when tenants heard endless screaming echoing from his apartment, or when his highly unusual amount of female visitors would literally never leave. Suspicions literally weren't even raised until more than 20 bodies were discovered in a nearby waterway. Then police declared they had a serious on the loose. Wow, shocking. Authorities were finally alerted the next time the screaming started in Grossman's rooms, and in August 1921, they burst in to find him standing over the bound body of a woman he had just killed, horror movie style. He was suspected of at least 23 other slayings, but took his own life on July 5th, 1922 before he could be executed. Grossman was given the title the Butcher of Berlin as a result of bizarre rumors surrounding his crime. See, our boy Grossman spent a lot of time in Berlin's Sicilian train station, which is where he picked up many of the women he would take back to his apartment to victimize, women whose bodies were never found. He also sold hot dogs to hungry travelers at the very same station, with a copious supply of them to boot, despite the food and especially meat shortages in Berlin at the time. So ladies and gentlemen, what isn't a hot dog? There had to be a cult somewhere in here, right? Well, this one operated on the ideology that I'm sure they'll be back, right? But not everyone is like Jesus, trooping on out of his grave a couple days after ending up in it. Margaretta Peter, though, thought if anyone was, it was damn well her. Fiercely religious religious, she spent some of her 20s wandering Switzerland to preach the word of God, and by 29 she had settled back in her small hometown with a loyal congregation, many of which were immediate family. Woo, we love a supportive family. In fact, they were so supportive that when Margaretta in 1823 became convinced that the devil was living in the rafters, they all went, yeah, that must be true. They had the same reaction to her declaration of being the Messiah, and then to her saying she's gonna start a battle against Satan. So naturally her whole congregation starts smashing up the house with farm tools before Margaretta suddenly announces to turn the tools on each other. So while a Kingsman-style battle is going down, Margaretta ups the ante, saying she needs to be sacrifice Jesus style, but her sister jumps up, Katniss Everdeen-like, and volunteers. So the collective congregation, including the whole family, swarm and kill her. Followers rip up floorboards, make a makeshift cross that they, well, then crucified Margs, y'all. The real deal. They lifted the cross up, Margs hollered she's gonna come back in 3 days, and told him to bash her head in, which they did. Then everyone just kind of waited around. 3 days go by, neither sister rise, and folks are starting to scratch their heads and look around a little, and finally somebody gets the police on this. They pull up, everyone goes in the paddy wagon, and off to jail. And now for the kiss goodnight. Lonely heart killers. They lure victims in via personal ads in the newspapers, which is an archaic ass sentence to say, but hey, one less way to die nowadays with newspapers going out of style. But Tinder did replace it, I guess. Bella Kiss spent some of the early years of the 1900s corresponding with women he connected with through ads in the newspaper. Yes, they had personal ads back then, but whatever. The women never seemed to stick around for long though. In 1914, Kiss was conscripted and went off to fight in the First World War, leaving behind his home, shed, a lovely little garden, a neatly trimmed lawn, and a collection of large metal drums on the property which he told neighbors contained gasoline. During the summer of 1916, Kiss was still away and some soldiers had approached the constable of Kinkota, which is where Kiss lived, inquiring about emergency fuel. Well, the constable remembers his homeboy Kiss has these big ass barrels and he could definitely spare some for his fellow soldiers. However, when one of the drums was open, there was no gasoline found in it. Instead, there was a human body. And in the next drum. And in the next drum. By the time they do a full search of Kiss's property, 24 bodies had been found, and Kiss, however, never was. Attempts to locate him were fruitless. The closest authorities ever came was in October of 1916, when a letter led them to a Serbian hospital in which Kiss had been allegedly recuperating from a battlefield injury. They scrambled themselves over there like the Scooby-Doo gang, but by the time they arrived, he was already gone, having placed the body of a dead soldier in his bed instead, and we still don't know where he went. First up, let's meet Pearl Hart. And let me start by saying that there's like 3 Pearls on this list. Wild West was a big fan of that name. And Pearl was a big fan of the Wild West. She was born in Canada around 1870, and by 17 she was married to a gambler and on the train to the Americas, running from her terrible father and a life of disguising herself as a boy to commit thefts to scrape by. At 22, she attempted to divorce said husband to pursue further opportunities in the West. A total ride-or-die dandy, Pearl's husband upped his life to chase her down, and when he found her, Pearl was already living it up with cigarettes, liquor, and even morphine. He won her back, but only before being drafted. After her husband left to fight in the Spanish-American War, Pearl, who was using her old cross-dressing ruse to commit thefts and crimes alike, met a man named Joe Boot, who was a career criminal. They robbed stagecoaches for a while before she was caught and jailed. Hart is famous for saying, "I shall not consent to be tried under a law in which my sex had no voice in making." She was eventually released, jail having helped her find sobriety, new skills, a career, and how to read and write. But the rest of her life is kind of unknown. America was shocked and thrilled by the idea of a female outlaw, and Pearl earned endless infamy from the age of 19. Newspapers clamored for interviews with Hart, while Cosmopolitan, a new magazine at the time, was obsessed with her and often sent reporters to try and get quotes out of her. The Old West never saw another woman like her. And Pearl wasn't the only one taking advantage of male privilege. Meet Charlie Parkhurst. And from 1812 until their death in 1879, nobody knew Charlie was biologically a woman. There's no official documentation on what Charlie identified as personally. If they felt themselves to be a woman or non-binary or transgender, we'll never know. The story goes that while in the poorhouse as an orphan, Charlie discovered that boys have a great advantage over girls in the battle of life, and they desired to become a boy because of it. But what we do know is that times were rough for ladies in the Wild West, so this crackerjack stagecoach driver decided to live most of their life as a man, driving stages for Wells Fargo and the California Stage Company, pulling cargoes of gold over tight mountain passes and open desert, at constant constant danger from rattlesnakes and desperados. But Charlie had the balls for it. They're remembered as short and stocky, a hard drinker, cigar smoker, and tobacco chewer who wore an eye patch after being kicked in the left eye by a horse, thus their nickname One-Eyed Charlie. Using their secret identity, Charlie was also a registered voter, and meaning they may have been the first American woman to ever cast a ballot, and nobody knew. After stagecoaching industry began to die due to the railroads, Charlie lived out the rest of their life raising cattle and chickens until their death in 1879. It was then that their true identity was revealed, much to the surprise of their brooding and brutal friends, and then it was documented to the world in newspapers, many of which actually appreciated who they'd been in their secret instead of belittling them in death. I'm sure Charlie would have loved to see that and know that. She's who you'd see in these old western films. Josephine Sarah Marcus. A smolderingly good-looking actor born in 1861, Marcus ran away to Tombstone, Arizona while touring with a theater group performing Gilbert and Sullivan's HMS Pinafore. She stuck around to marry Sheriff John Banham, but 2 years later when notorious criminal Wyatt Earp showed up, well, her marriage went cold very coincidentally as she got all hot over tall, dark, and handsome Earp. Josephine and Earp fell in genuine love, and she'd supposedly be the reason behind the famous duel at the OK Corral, a 30-second flurry of gunfire involving the Wild West superstars Doc Holliday, the Clayton brothers, and of course, the Earps. He, unlike many, was unbothered and actually more intrigued by her Jewish heritage. The Earps lived an okay life once they settled a bit, moving between mining and oil camps and eventually California to promote a movie about Wyatt Earp's lawman exploits. Unfortunately, Wyatt passes away before this is accomplished, leaving Josephine to battle it out with the studios and writers who take the original biography and turn it upside down. A commercialized depiction of her husband and an unflattering portrayal of her is released called Wyatt Earp Frontier Marshal. It came out in 1931 and fueled 50 years of Wyatt Earp mania, pro and con in print and film. Until she died, Josephine worked hard to have the correct documentation of her beloved life released. She passed away in 1944 and claimed until her dying day that Wyatt Earp was her one and only true love. Here's another one, Pearl Devere. She is one of the most famous madams in history. This red-haired siren was born in Indiana around 1860 and made her way to Colorado during the Silver Panic of 1893. Devere told her family she was a dress designer, but in fact rose to fame as the Old Homestead, a luxurious brothel in Cripple Creek, Colorado. The price of a night's stay could cost patrons $250, which at the time was insane, but more so in comparison to how most hotels at the time charged about $3 a night. The building was reportedly equipped with an intercom system and boasted fine carpets, imported furniture and drinks, and chandeliers. As beautiful as she was sharp, the Rose of the Wild Bunch. Daughter to Germanic mother and Native American father, Laura Bullion faced discrimination and inability to fit in right away. But that's okay, she followed her father in the footsteps of career criminal. And while working as an escort in Texas, she becomes involved with Will Carver, who had been her married-in uncle until her aunt's recent demise. Now widowed, Carver took 15-year-old Laura to Utah with him, where he begins working with Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch in 1898, as does Laura. Laura Bullion helped the gang by fencing goods and money for them and was known to the group as Della Rose and often called the Rose of the Wild Bunch. Her affections also turned to Bill Kilpatrick, a member of the group, and they became lovers. Having taken part in several train robberies with the Wild Bunch, Kilpatrick and Bullion returned to Texas with William Carver, where Carver was ambushed and killed by lawmen on April 1st of 1901. Bullion and Kilpatrick then fled to St. Louis, Missouri, where they were arrested on November 8th of 1901. Kilpatrick was found guilty of robbery and sentenced to 15 years in prison, while Laura was sentenced to 5. After serving 3.5 of those years, Laura was released from Missouri State Penitentiary at Jefferson City, Missouri on September 19th of 1905 and lived the last years of her life in Memphis, Tennessee, under the name Freda Lincoln, where she was a seamstress and a dressmaker. She passed away on December 2nd, 1961, and is buried in Memphis under a tombstone that reads Freda Bullion Lincoln, Laura Bullion, the Thorny Rose. Next, Mary Ellen Pleasant, the most powerful black woman in the Golden Rush era. Historians indicate that Pleasant was most likely born a slave but got her freedom at an early age. She worked on the Underground Railroad as a young adult, ushering enslaved people out of the South and into the northern states. Like many others seeking their fortunes during the Gold Rush, Pleasant and her husband moved to San Francisco. Here, she works as a cook and waitress and a professional eavesdropper. I know we're all taught not to be nosy, but Mary Ellen learned from the conversations of wealthy patrons, intentionally listening in for valuable information. She took what she learned and began applying it as bank banking and monetary skills that launched her immediately upwards. She took what she learned to help build a substantial fortune and eventually became one of the richest women in the city. Pleasant was an astute investor whose portfolio included real estate, railroads, restaurants, boarding houses. Pleasant's wealth, however, could not shield her from racism. In 1866, a streetcar conductor in San Francisco refused to let her board because she was black. Outraged, Mary Ellen sued, and the case went all the way to the California Supreme Court. In a historic decision, the courts ruled that segregation on streetcars was illegal in California. However, in return, the Supreme Court reversed the damages Pleasant had been awarded in a lower court ruling. You win some, you lose some, and sometimes you get both. And now it's Donna Barcelo. Described as the supreme queen of refinement and fashion, Donna Barcelo was a prominent saloon owner and a professional gambler in Santa Fe in the 1830s and 1840s. Barcelo was recognized for her charm and sharp business skills, which helped her establish as an influential member of high society during the heyday of the Santa Fe Trail. In 1835, Barcelo opened a hotel and casino in the city center of Santa Fe. The establishment encompassed an entire city block and featured lavish decorations including chandeliers, drapes, mirrors, and imported furnishings. The casino became a destination for local socialites and trail travelers for its opulence. Barcelo oversaw the casino's operations and regaled patrons as one of the card dealers, widely known as the best dealer of the card game Monte across the entire Southwest. Seeking trade deals and investments that increased her wealth and social status, exercised economic and political sway, she made her fortune from real estate and gold ventures in addition to her casino. And when the American civilian government established itself in Santa Fe during the Mexican-American War in 1846, Barcelo allied herself with Americans and assisted them by providing information and at times money. Accounts and representation of Barcelo were often embellished by those who had labeled her the Queen of Sin. Barcelo continued to operate her casino through the 1840s and died in January of 1852. Upon her death, she left several residences, properties, and fortune to her family, including 2 adopted daughters, in addition to substantial contributions to the Catholic Church and the city of Santa Fe to be used for charitable endeavors. Next up is Sing Choi. She's also known by the name China Mary and was an unofficial leader of Tombstone's Chinese community in the 1880s who supplied labor and opened laundries, restaurants, gambling halls, dens, and a general store. The Old West will always be remembered as an era of cowboy, but during its peak years, Tombstone was actually controlled by a female immigrant. She arrived in Tombstone sometime around 1879, and at that time the Chinese population was 11 people, and she recognized the unprecedented profits waiting in the western boom towns. Mary's general store was in the center of Hoptown, a Chinese district of Tombstone. Mary's store dealt in both American and Chinese merchandise, and she gained a reputation as a universal accommodator. Everyone knew that nothing in Hoptown was done without China Mary's go-ahead, and so she was held in the highest of esteem throughout Tombstone society. She was an organized and shrewd business operator who had an attitude that discourse was bad for business. Her private police force handled any problem that arose within her community. Mary enjoyed the highest of respect. As a result, she could act as a sort of intermediary between her community and other ethnic groups. She was the conduit that made cooperation possible. She was not only a cunning businesswoman, but a sympathetic humanitarian and calculating capitalist. Mary was a genuine immigrant success story. Even as a woman in the Old West, she wielded real power. She died in December of 1906 from heart failure when she was 67. Flesh is in the name and it's her game. Susan LaFleche. This is the story of the first Native American to earn a medical degree. Born on an Omaha res in Nebraska as a young girl, she watched a sick indigenous woman wait all night for a white doctor who, after being called several times, just never came. The woman died the next day, and as Susan later wrote, "She saw the need of my people for a good physician." Susan's father taught her her own culture and traditions and then sent her to the reservation's Presbyterian school where she learned English, and then high school for further education to survive colonial society. She applies to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. It's a bold move on her part because even during this time, the most privileged of white women of America faced enormous backlash when attempting a medical degree, let alone a poor native girl. Despite this, she graduated a year early and first in her class. Rejecting a potentially comfortable life on the East Coast, she returns to the Omaha reservation and became the sole doctor for more than 1,200 people across 400 plus miles, and she was only 24 years old. She marries, she has 2 kids, and she never stops. In fact, she keeps going till she has enough donations and supplies to open the first hospital on a reservation that was not funded by the government. Unlike the absent doctor that she remembered from her childhood, Susan helped anyone who needed it, regardless of race or ethnicity. On September 18th of 1915, Susan passes away. She worked hard to build a bridge between 2 worlds as her father advised, and it was evident at her funeral. 3 priests eulogized her, but but it was a member of the Omaha tribe who delivered the final words in the Omaha language. And now for the last lady on the list, Cathy Williams, who also went in reverse as Williams Cathay from 1866 to 1868 with the famed Buffalo Soldiers who patrolled the 900-mile Santa Fe Trail. She was the first African-American female soldier to enlist in the Army. She's the only documented black woman to serve in the Army in the 19th century, and she's the only known black female soldier to be a part of the Buffalo Soldiers. Post-war job opportunities for newly freed slaves and for African Americans in general were non-existent, so many had no choice but to turn to the military service for employment stability, but also newfound access to healthcare, education, post-war benefits by way of pension. Her enlistment starts in November of 1866 in St. Louis, Missouri. A cursory examination by an Army surgeon should have outed Williams as a woman, but since the Army didn't require full medical exams at the time, she was minty. Eventually, her third round with smallpox has a surgeon discover her secret in 1868. The post-surgeon found out I was a woman and I got my discharge. The men all wanted to get rid of me after they found out I was a woman. Some of them acted real bad to me, Williams said. Once again, dressed as a man, Williams signed up to an emerging all-black regiment, the 38th U.S. Infantry, which would eventually become part of the legendary Buffalo Soldiers. These units dotted out the landscape of the American West and showed tremendous skill and valor in a range of duties. They fought in skirmishes with indigenous people, escorted vulnerable wagon trains, built forts, mapped the territory, protected white settlers, all with subpar equipment and a lot of racism towards them. In trying to make a life for herself, Williams could not have known her story had traveled. It landed with a St. Louis Reporter, and in January 2nd of 1876 edition of the St. Louis Times Daily, Williams officially became a headline when her story was published. Accounts say she died in 1893 shortly after being denied disability compensation required for her illness. Not for being undeserving of it, but simply because they couldn't grant it to her due to the fact she lied about being a man.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have Cleopatra and Ptolemy VIII. We'll head over to 47 BC, at a time where ancient Egypt was a little different. We often think of Cleopatra's end, but the beginning of her life was quite hectic as well, even for the royal family. Cleopatra had two younger brothers who both ruled with her after the death of their father, Ptolemy XII. Ptolemy XIII initially ruled with Cleopatra. They were a historical duo, but they soon became rivals. Ptolemy wanted the throne to himself, so he attempted to seize control of Egypt. This led to a civil war in which Cleopatra was exiled. However, after Caesar defeated Ptolemy's army and restored Cleopatra to the throne, Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile River while attempting to flee a battle. Talk about family drama. I thought mine was bad, but dang. In our number 9 spot today we have King Henry VIII. Henry's marriages were significant in the history of England because they played a major role in the English Reformation and the establishment of the Church of England as a separate entity from the Catholic Church. Yeah, a few of those family scandals ought to do it. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, he quickly divorced after she failed to produce a male heir. Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, who he of course married immediately after his divorce from Catherine, a little sketchy, well, she was later accused of adultery and treason and lost her head. It wasn't good. Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, gave him this long-awaited male heir, Edward VI. Sadly, she died soon after giving birth. Next was Anne, Henry's fourth wife, whom he married for political reasons but found unattractive and divorced shortly after. He saw a painting of her before and she didn't match the image. Swear to God that's what happened. Like, what in the Tinder? This guy is absolutely insane. Next was Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, who was only 17 at the time. She was accused of adultery and also lost her life. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, survived him for a change and went on to marry again after his death. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived, alright? Study that for your history test. In our number 8 spot today we have Julia the Elder. Julius Caesaris was the only biological child of Roman Emperor Augustus. She was born in 39 BC and was married to Marcus Claudius Marcellus, but later got caught up in a series of scandals that brought shame to her family. So much so that her father actually exiled her to a small island off of the coast of Italy in 2 BC. She remained in exile for several years and her marriage to Marcellus was annulled. In 2 AD, Augustus allowed her to return back to the mainland, but she was still considered an outcast and was forced to live in seclusion for the rest of her life. This was less than 10 years after her mother had suffered suffered the same fate. What an absolute nightmare. In our number 7 spot today, we have King James I. We're taking it back to Scotland in 1425. King James I ordered the death of a powerful nobleman who just also happened to be James' cousin. Murdoch Stewart, Duke of Albany, was the grandson of King Robert II and had served as regent for James while he was imprisoned in England. However, once James returned to Scotland, he suspected Murdoch of plotting against him. Murdoch and several of his followers were arrested and killed in Stirling Castle. King James' actions were seen as a ruthless demonstration of his power and authority, and he faced quite a bit of criticism for this harsh treatment. In our number 6 spot today, we have John the Fearless. In 1407, Duke of Burgundy John the Fearless ordered the death of Duke of Orleans Louis I, aka John's cousin. A lot of cousin rivalries in this list. At the time, of course, he was his political rival in the French court, but what is happening? The two men were powerful and influential members of the French nobility, and their feud had been building for quite some time. See, John believed that Louis was a threat to his power, and he had also insulted him publicly, which for sure doesn't help the case. Louis was ambushed and killed by a group of armed men in the streets of Paris. John was heavily criticized for his actions, and the incident even went as far as to spark a civil war in France. The conflict lasted for several years and resulted in political instability and, sadly, lots of lives lost in France. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Brutal Benders, also known as the Bloody Benders. If their name didn't hint towards it, they were a family of who operated in Labette County, Kansas in the late 19th century. The family consisted of John Bender, his wife Elvira, and their adult children Kate and John Jr. They ran a small inn and a general store that became a popular stop for travelers passing through the area. However, the family was also known to rob and/or kill their guests. Just a minor inconvenience if you want to stop in at the inn. They would lure travelers into their home, act friendly, and then completely switch on them. The family's crimes were eventually discovered in 1873, but they fled the area before they could be brought to justice. Lovely. What year was this again? I don't think they're alive anymore, thank God. Well, who knows? In our number 4 spot today, we have Fred and Rose West. We've heard of Bonnie and Clyde, but what about Fred and Rose West? Ugh. The two were a married couple who committed a series of brutal killings in England during the 1970s and 80s. Their victims were usually women, and they buried their bodies in and around their home. The couple was thankfully arrested in 1994 after police discovered the remains of several victims. While awaiting trial, Fred took his own life in prison. Rose was found guilty of killing 10 people and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Definitely one of the worst when it comes to British criminal history. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Cray Twins. Ronnie and Reginald Cray. Where do I even begin here? On paper, these twins were lavish, they had very bubbly personalities, and were often associated with celebrities and politicians. Deep down, these British gangsters were much, much more. The Cray Twins operated in London's East End during the 1950s and 1960s. They were involved in organized crime like protection rackets, arson, and they took a handful of lives. They were eventually arrested and sentenced to life in 1969 for killing Jack McVitie and George Cornell. The Cray's legacy has been depicted in many films, books, and documentaries, and they remain among the most notorious figures in British criminal history. In our number 2 spot today, we have King Rudolph II. We'll do a little palate cleanser before we finish off out with big bad number 1. King Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor in 1552. He was known as a collector of sorts. Some royals collect stamps, others collect zoo animals. Okay. His home was dangerous, to say the least. His castle was home to lions, tigers, and orangutans, so good luck getting 8 hours of sleep. Not gonna happen. He also liked to collect human artifacts. That one's a little bit more jarring than the zoo animals, right? I mean, literally, King Rudolph II had random bones and body parts in jars, all in the name of science. Watch out for the animal droppings and the jars of teeth. Welcome home. King Rudolph II is of course quite important in history as he supported the scientific Greek Revolution quite a bit, hence the jars, you know? He also poured tons of money into astrology. He's into the cosmos and the kidneys. What a guy, alright? He's got a lot of interests. In our number 1 spot today, we have Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. We'll end on our least favorite Canadian couple, Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. They committed a series of brutal assaults and killings in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Their victims included Homolka's sister, as well as several other young women. Absolutely disgusting. Bernardo was known for his inhumane acts in Scarborough. He even had a nasty nickname for them before his true, even more disgusting identity was revealed. The couple has since been dubbed the Ken and Barbie killers due to their Wonder Bread appearance. Homolka had made a plea with prosecutors testifying against Bernardo in exchange for a reduced sentence. Meanwhile, Bernardo was eventually convicted of several charges and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Hashtag by Ken.
Number 10. Hidden Beached Whale. Look closely at this 1641 landscape from Henrik van Anthussenen. This masterpiece here is titled View of Scheveningen Sands. Now, do you notice anything out of the ordinary? Anything weird about this 1600s beach day going on? Besides everyone wearing pants, obviously so hot. What is everybody looking at, right? Almost nothing. I feel like we're missing something in the photo, like say maybe, I don't know, a beached whale. Turns out after hundreds and hundreds of years, hiding in the painting this entire time was a beached whale. 2014, this was breaking news in the art world. Now at some point after it had been completed, the work of art was painted over. Somebody's like, you know what? I don't like that whale. See ya, ancient Photoshop, gone. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, somebody was looking at this wondering what the meaning behind the photo is. It was a beached whale the whole time. It was haunting them the entire time. They never knew. Number 9, The Old Guitarist. Any Game of Thrones fans out there? Rewatching it right now. This has some White Walker vibes behind it for sure. The Old Guitarist is, well, it's exactly what you'd think. It's a painting of an old man hunched over with white hair and, well, he's playing the guitar. This would be a creepy painting regardless, but when Pablo Picasso was putting together this masterpiece back in the early 1900s, he had some tricks up his sleeve. In 1998, researchers used infrared on the painting. Yeah, National Treasure style, how cool is that? And lo and behold, there was a hidden woman. A painting of a hidden woman, not a real life, that'd be scary. But there was a painting just staring back at you. How creepy is that? Another woman was painted underneath the elderly man. So because this paint was naturally fading, she's now becoming easier and easier to see as time goes on. So that's haunting, I guess. Let's move on. Number 8, Madam X. Shield your eyes, we got some scandalous spaghetti straps coming in hot. This painting was deemed too scandalous back in the day. And no, I'm not joking. Madame X, the portrait of Virginie Amelio Avenue Gautreau, was originally painted back in 1884 by John Singer Sargent. Now at first, John made the woman's strap sliding off her shoulder. A little artsy, a little whoopsie strap slip, but back then this was a no-go. No, that was too scandalous for the upper class society around him. So John had to actually go back and repaint the strap back on. Backlash was still so strong after John had sold the painting that he was actually forced to move. Yeah, the guy left Paris because of spaghetti straps. What do we do? Number 7, The Lady in the Grass. A piece by Van Gogh. Let's do it. Patch of Grass was a Van Gogh classic. It was done in 1887. Now, upon first glance, the painting appears to be, well, nothing more than that. It's just a patch of grass. But in 2008, much later, Dutch researchers used an X-ray to take a deeper look into this grass, and they found the portrait of a woman. Yeah, another woman just staring back. That's unnerving, and it turns out around 1/3 of Van Gogh's artwork has old paintings underneath them. It's just taken so long for technology to now allow us to see the hidden picture. Literally, the hidden picture. Joris Deek of the Delft University of Technology, he has the coolest job ever. He peels back layers of paint digitally. That's like Spy Kids stuff right there. Currently, the painting is hanging in the Dutch eastern city Atterlo in the Kroller-Müller Museum. So if you ever go there and take a look at this masterpiece, just know there's a woman looking back at you as you look. Cool. Number 6, Mona Lisa. All right, another woman, this one a little more popular. The 15th century masterpiece from, again, Da Vinci. Let's talk scandals. There's already been hundreds of theories surrounding this painting, like perhaps, she could have been pregnant. Given her stance and the veil over her shoulders, sure, checks out, I guess. But back in 2011, a clue was found in the painting. Yeah, a clue, like national treasure. I love these painting clues that we're now finding. Silvano Vincetti supposedly found letters and numbers painted into her eyes. teeny tiny numbers and letters, which is terrifying. I was at my desk earlier and my forehead was touching the screen. I was looking so hard, I had to find it. The L over her right eye means Leonardo, and in the other eye, there's a 72. So we believe so far that this relates to Christianity and Judaism. 7, the creation of the world, and 2, the duality of men and women. Now, meanwhile, I'm over here drawing, those cool S's, thinking that I'm the shit. Nothing, not even close to this level. Artists are insane. Number 5. Cafe Terrace at night. Upon first glance, you can tell this is a piece done by the fabulous Vincent van Gogh. The blue tones, the streaks. I myself recently did the Van Gogh experience downtown Toronto and it was mesmerizing. I have a few pints, go look at walls move around. That's good, I guess. While his 1888 painting Cafe Terrace at night looks like a quiet late night summer dream, there's something sinister really going on. Now, I'm not a Van Gogh expert myself by any means, but Jared Baxter definitely is. And back in 2015, Jared brought forth this idea that Cafe Terrace at night was really Van Gogh's version of The Last Supper. And it checks out. The figure in the center with the long hair, the 12 surrounding individuals, one of which is slipping into darkness. I don't know, it all makes sense now. Can't unsee it. Jared Baxter also believes there are hidden crucifixes in this painting, so that's fun. Keep your eyes peeled, I guess. If you're doing Where's Waldo, amp it up a bit. Number 4, Bill Clinton. We've all heard that clip downloading music growing up. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. Maybe that's in this painting. If you listen closely, you can hear it. Back in 2006, former US President Bill Clinton showed off this beautiful portrait of himself done by the incredible artist John Nelson Shanks. Now, as far as portraits go, this is beautiful. The art is beautiful, yada, yada, yada. But that pose, I don't know. Something's off about this pose, right? Well, that's because the shadow on the left side of the portrait is meant to represent Monica Lewinsky. Yeah, we knew it. That's that voice in my head, that LimeWire voice kicking in. We felt her somewhere in here, you know what I mean? The artist himself, again, John Nelson Shanks, confirmed that this was true. He used the dress shape as symbolism surrounding the scandal. Imagine that. Imagine your side chick just haunting you forever in that painting. Number 3, The Anguished Man. First of all, aside from its dark history, who would be able to look at this painting? I don't want this on my wall at all. Imagine this in your place. That's like from The Conjuring. That's terrifying to look at. The Anguished Man is a painting with thick, rich, bloody history. It's said to be haunted by the spirit of the artist who created it, which is fun. The artist apparently mixed their own blood into the paint while they were working away, so must have been a Ryerson folk right there. The painting has been passed down through generations of the artist's family, but each owner has reported strange occurrences while in possession of the haunting piece. Fair, obviously, of course you're gonna get haunted. Look at this thing. Some have claimed to hear whispers and moaning coming from the painting late at night, which is the funniest thing and also the scariest thing I could ever imagine. Imagine a moaning painting trying to get a snack out of the fridge. Ew, shut up. That's so gross. Put it on the floor. Would you spend the night with this painting on your wall, next to you, in the other room, somewhere in your presence? I don't think I could do it. Comment down below. Would you want this painting? Do you like it? I don't know. Are you an artist? Are you a painter? Tell me about your work. Send me your work. Send me a painting. I'll put it up. I don't care. Just don't make it haunted or made of your own blood. We're good. Number 2, Portrait of Bernardo de Galvez. Bernardo de Galvez, he was a nobleman and a military leader who played a significant role in the American Revolution. He was widely regarded as a hero for his efforts to aid the American colonies in their fight against British rule. Now, some believe that there is a curse attached to his portrait. Of course, or else I wouldn't put it in the list. That'd be kind of boring. According to this legend, anybody who looks directly into the eyes of Bernardo's portrait, right there, that one right there, will suffer a terrible, terrible fate. So don't look, I guess. Just click like, subscribe, but don't look. That's how we do it. The curse was born during the Spanish-American War when American soldiers apparently looted Galvez's home in Louisiana. They took his portrait as a trophy. Again, how to get cursed 101. That's what you do. Since then, several people have come into possession of the portrait or stared deep into the portrait's eyes, like I have numerous times, and they experienced misfortune. So who knows? That's awesome. I'm glad I whipped together this list. Sorry, editors, you have to look at that photo. One man inherited the portrait from his grandfather and he hung it in his home. Now, not long after that, he lost his job and his wife left him. That's it, a double no-no. Another tale involved a museum curator who displayed the painting and then shortly after he suffered a heart attack. Probably by just looking at it, that would be my guess, but who knows? Could be some cursed artifact history behind it. Even those who have seen photographs of the portrait claim to feel uneasy or experience strange occurrences afterwards. Yeah, that one right there, that photo. That's the one they're talking about. Number 1, Erase to Kooning. We have to finish with a nice funny one because It's my favorite art thing ever. I was so excited to talk about this one. This drawing, or erasing rather, was done by the one and only Robert Rauschenberg. Now, Robert wanted to explore whether or not a piece of art could be created by removing marking rather than by adding them. Yeah, sure. Try this on your art teacher next time. Step one here was honestly kind of hilarious. First, Robert had to ask his very successful friend, fellow Dutch artist William de Kooning, for one of his brand new, beautiful drawings. And Robert, well, he just erased it. All of it, pretty much, 97% of it gone. Pretty much the entire thing. After erasing his art, Robert then added a frame, put it up, and then called it art. What a weird move, what a weird play. Some loved it, some were like, ah yes, this is new, this is art, this is it. While others called the act pure vandalism, which I gotta be honest, I'm leaning more towards that one here. 1953, this changed the game. De Kooning's involvement also didn't help. They're like, why did you give it to him? Did you not know he was gonna erase it? He's like, no, I did. I don't know. Scandals, art scandals, who knew?
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Nero. For this one, we are taking it all the way back to the age of the Roman Empire. When we think back to these times, they weren't necessarily the most kind, peaceful of times, but there certainly are some characters that stand out as being particularly brutal, and one of those is Nero. Throughout his reign, he wreaked havoc on the Roman Empire, he burned cities, he killed thousands of people, including every member of his own family, and I mean, we know the inventive execution methods of the past, so you can probably guess at just how brutal these all were. Most Roman sources give us an almost completely negative review of him in reference to both his personality and his reign as a leader. He was called compulsive and corrupt, and it is believed that he is actually to blame for the great fire that burned Rome, but instead he used the Christians as a scapegoat so that they would receive punishments rather than him. In the end, after being declared a public enemy by the Roman Senate and realizing that the rebellion would be lost, he ended up taking his own life at the age of 30. In our number 9 spot today, we have Shoko Asahara. Leader of the Shinriko cult, this person claimed to be the reincarnation of the Hindu god Shiva. He said that he was destined to lead his followers to salvation once the apocalypse came, but then once he lured in followers, he claimed that he could also teach them to levitate and develop telepathic abilities. Seems very legit. Apparently, those who were the most skeptical, he allowed them to drink his bathwater. No idea why or what this was supposed to be for, and I wish I could unlearn it to be honest, but now we all just have to suffer with that information together. The cult continued to grow and drew in influential and wealthy people, and what did he do? Well, he made a science division of this cult, and this is where they studied the microorganisms living in his bathwater. I'm just kidding, it was actually really messed up. The group went on to attack Tokyo in 1994, which took the lives of 7 people. Then in 1995, they released gas into the Tokyo underground, which led to 12 deaths, 50 injured people, and more than 5,000 people with temporary vision problems. In the end, he and 11 of his disciples ended up being arrested and charged, and they were all sentenced to death in 2004. In our number 8 spot today, we have Victoriano Alvarez. Clipperton Island was an island that is located in the Pacific, and during the 18th and 19th century, everyone was trying to lay claim to it and rule it. I'm talking about Britain, France, Mexico, and of course, our friend Victoriano. He was actually the lighthouse keeper on the island, and in 1910, when Mexico needed to stop sending vital supplies to the island because they were focused on the rising revolution happening there, most of the inhabitants ended up contracting scurvy, which sadly led to their death. In the end, only Victoriano, a small group of soldiers, and about 12 women and children were left. The soldiers ended up passing away shortly after in an accident, so you know what Mr. Lighthouse did? He threw all but one of the rifles into the sea, loaded the one remaining weapon, and like the worst person he is, he declared himself king of the island. From here, he went on to kill anyone who disagreed with him, and he was also extremely harmful to the women who unfortunately were left on the island. That was until one badass woman named Tirza Randon simply had enough. She found a hammer and, well, the rest is history. In our number 7 spot today, we have Richard Nixon. This is perhaps one of the largest scandals and leaks in history, especially in the history of the United States. In the middle of 1972, there were 5 men who were arrested for breaking into and subsequently trying to bug the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel complex in Washington, D.C. As the year went on, the 1972 presidential election came closer, and there was an anonymous source who fed information to Washington Post reporters Carla Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward that, quote, "The Watergate bugging incident stemmed from a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage conducted on behalf of President Nixon's re-election and directed by officials of the White House. Despite this information leak and it being reported in the news, Nixon was still re-elected, but he was also under serious investigation. There were a series of Senate hearings, and the Senate even went on to create a special investigative committee. The hearings were broadcast nationwide, and they had witnesses testifying that Nixon had approved plans to cover up administration involvement in the break-in, and that there was a voice-activated taping system in the Oval Office. These hearings captured the attention of Americans everywhere for weeks, and in the end the United States Supreme Court ruled that Nixon had to release these Oval Office tapes to government investigators, which then went on to reveal that he had not only attempted to cover up what went on, but he also later tried to use federal officials to deflect the investigation. Under the threat of an imminent impeachment, Nixon had no choice but to admit his guilt and resign, making him the only president to do so. His successor, Gerald Ford, ended up pardoning him, so he escaped prosecution, but there were 69 other people indicted, with 48 of them later being convicted. Remember that anonymous source who spilled the information in the first place? Well, his identity remained a secret for 33 years until 2005, when former FBI agent Mark Felt revealed himself as the source. This is probably the biggest political scandal in US history, and it revealed corruption beyond what Americans at the time could believe. It truly changed the way that people would look at government leaders forever. In our number 6 spot today, we have Kurt Gödel. The Austrian-American philosopher and mathematician Kurt Gödel lived from 1906 to 1978, and he made quite a name for himself. Being compared to the likes of Aristotle and Einstein, he is best known for his incompleteness theorem, which was a very significant mathematical result. He was obviously very successful and found himself teaching and educating a younger generation, but his personal life is where things got quite dark. When he was just 6 years old, he had a case of rheumatic fever which left him quite ill for the rest of his childhood. This led to him first being pretty preoccupied with his health, and unfortunately this turned into hypochondria, which then led him down a path of complete paranoia. He ended up having an irrational fear of getting poisoned, so to avoid this he would only eat food that had been prepared by his wife, who also had to taste it beforehand. Sadly, his wife was hospitalized in 1977 for 6 months, which obviously left her unable to prepare food for him. Because of the fact that she was unable to do this for him, during this period he refused to eat, which eventually led to him starving to death. In our number 5 spot today, we have Albert Fall. Albert Fall was the Secretary of the Interior to former President Warren G. Harding, and while in this position, he decided to secretly allow oil companies to tap into the Teapot Dome oil reserve in Wyoming and the Elk Hills oil reserve in California. Of course, the reason he did this is because he could make a ton of extra money doing this, like several $100,000. This all started to unravel though in 1922, when there was an expose that revealed that the oil had been sold without any sort of competitive bidding. After this expose, Robert La Follette, who was a senator from Wisconsin, created an investigation into the story by the Senate Committee on Public Lands. The Attorney General at the time, Harry Dougherty, began to get some flack for not investigating this alleged corruption, so Harry turned to the FBI director to help him out. The FBI director, William J. Burns, sent an agent to Robert, the senator from Wisconsin's office, to search for anything that could be used to blackmail him into stopping the investigation into the corruption. Despite this seemingly obvious threat, Robert knew that this meant that his investigation was going to reveal something serious, which motivated him to continue on with it. In the end, the shady dealings and all of the bribery was revealed, and Albert Fall was officially exposed. This entire ordeal led to him being the first United States cabinet secretary to go to prison. In our number 4 spot today, we have Velvely Dickinson. Velvely is a name I've never heard before, and I thought it sounded kinda cool and nice until I heard about the person it belonged to. Velvely is one of the reasons why we should never judge a book by its cover. On the outside, she appeared to be like a regular older lady who ran a doll store. Who would think the owner of a doll store would ever be a villain? Okay, maybe everyone. But anyway, as far as I know, everything started out more normal, but once her husband passed away from a heart attack, things took a very sinister twist as she started to take on some interesting side projects for a little extra cash. In 1942, the FBI was able to intercept a letter that was on its way to Buenos Aires. The letter spoke of a quote, wonderful doll hospital and quote, 3 old English dolls, and the FBI was like, hey, That's kinda weird. So their cryptographers went to work and it was uncovered that this letter was actually sent in code. As it turns out, these letters were actually sending military secrets to Japan, and some of the information within them would have been extremely valuable if the letter hadn't been intercepted and never delivered. Turns out that Velvely had visited the Japanese Institute in New York, befriended the consul general, and connected with a Japanese naval attaché. The FBI arrested Dickinson, and upon doing so, they found huge amounts of cash along with the instructions for the code she was to use in the letters. She ended up being sentenced to 10 years in prison. In our number 3 spot today, we have Monica Witt. Monica is a former United States Air Force technical sergeant as well as defense contractor who has been on the run since 2018. Despite her high-ranking position and high security clearance, she is on the run because she defected to Iran in 2013. It is said that from 2013 up until she was found out that she was using her position in order to spy on the United States and relay that information back to the group she was working for. She used different fake Facebook accounts, and it is said that the information she gave included the classified true name and counterintelligence activities of a US intelligence operative. This is of course a problem regardless of how important this operative was, but it is said that this information she shared had the potential to cause serious damage to United States national security. It truly is an absolutely wild story, and Monica is still out there on the run, hiding from the consequences of her betrayal and espionage. In our number 2 spot today, we have Irene of Athens. Taking it back to the Byzantine Empire, Irene of Athens was the mother of Constantine VI, and while the pair co-ruled together for almost 2 decades, things ended in quite the tragedy. After the pair co-ruled, Irene did go on to rule on her own from 797 to 802 CE, but you might be wondering how she managed to outrule her son. Well, Irene, the ambitious ruler, wanted full control all to herself, so she asked for the help of some political allies to pull off a scheme against her own son. She began to lead a conspiracy against him to try and get him out of power. The duo did end up reconciling their relationship, but this is not where the story ends. In 786, the public began to turn their backs on Constantine because he had decided to divorce his wife and instead marry his mistress. Irene saw this as a second chance and once again chose to conspire against her own son. Honestly, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, this lady did not care. Here's where things in the story get exceptionally gory though. Irene not only ordered the arrest of her son, but also ordered that his eyes be gouged out. Yep, that's how good old Mumsy came into power. Finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have Boy Jones. Okay, I've heard of people being called Boy Jones before, but little did I know Boy Jones was a very real and very creepy person. His full name was Edward Jones, and this little rascal basically stalked the Queen from 1838 to 1841. He managed to break into Buckingham Palace, and we aren't just talking about once, we are talking about many times. He knew exactly where to go and what to do, and once in the castle, well, he would hide under the Queen's sofa, he would sit on her throne, and worst of all, he would go through her clothing, like a little creep. He even went as far as to steal her clothes, which is just stupid, of course. Taking evidence of your crimes is bad practice. Thankfully, he did finally get caught, but man, a few years of sneaking in and sitting on the throne. That's crazy.
Starting our list is John Joel Glanton and his notorious gang. Like many Wild West figures on our list, he's got 2 pistols, a bounty on his head, and a long southern name. John was a soldier of fortune as much as an outlaw. Being an outlaw sent him running to Texas, where in 1835 he was living with his parents. It's during his time there that he marries, but it was a high tension time period with the indigenous people of the South, and he unfortunately lost his first wife in one of their raids. In 1849 he leaves behind his second wife, who's said to be the most beautiful woman in the Republic of Texas, to ride out of San Antonio for California with 30 well-armed gold seekers. He used his hatred of indigenous peoples to fuel his bounty hunting and again to collect and trade scalps and skulls for money. By 1850, however, it became increasingly difficult for the Glanton gang to find bounties for indigenous people, specifically his Sikh preference, and the group began to attack peaceful agricultural clans in the vicinity of Fort El Notre. He even started to attack innocent Mexican settlements in order to claim false bounties. His final escalation was when his gang seized a river ferry. While operating the ferry, they killed Mexican and American passengers alike for their money and goods. Ethnicity of the target no longer mattered to them, but thankfully they were stopped by the Yuma indigenous clan in the mid-1850s. What you reap is what you sow. These next escape artists were led by Judd Roberts. They robbed and killed an innocent rancher in 1885. Before that, Judd and his gang of 4 didn't really have much notoriety,
variety, they'd collected some bounties, and they had some on their own heads. But they were never caught, always evading capture. Well, this time the Texas Rangers captured Roberts and one of his men. This was a time where hanging was the most sought after punishment, so Roberts and his cohort were put in the newest, most escape-proof jail in San Antonio. They may have only just become known names, but their ability to evade and escape authorities was always acknowledged. A short time later, a third member of the Roberts' gang is captured and placed in a lesser protected prison. With only one man still free, it's no surprise that local jail immediately and mysteriously burnt down, roasting the desperado inside alive. After 4 months, Roberts and his cohort escape from the San Antonio jail as predicted, reunite with their third, and Roberts was soon stealing horses in the Texas Panhandle once more. He periodically visited Williamson County to see relatives and friends, and Texas Ranger Ira Atten was dispatched to intercept him. After several clashes and near misses, the future Ranger John Hughes killed Roberts in the Panhandle. Eyes, knees, fingers, toes. Well, if we're counting, Three-Finger Jack had an obvious amount. Jokes aside, he didn't actually have 3 fingers. This is just one of those cool Western nicknames on the list. A notorious Arizona outlaw, he'd been captured and jailed back in 1895. I guess prison escape was super easy back then because he busted out and joined the Blackjack Christians. He's in this gang until he meets Bert Alvord and Billy Stiles. It's hard not to be nervous around them after all. They were sheriffs, but only by day. In some strange twist, these two, who you'll be learning about next, were outlaws by night. Alongside them were their posse of 4. During a train robbery in Fairbank, Texas, the train pulled into the station, and as the crowd was milling around, the outlaws mingled in the crowd pretending to be drunken cowboys. Sheriff Jeff Milton was standing in the open door of the baggage car when the outlaws opened fire, and he unfortunately was hit. While he was bleeding, the sheriff waited for the bystanders to clear, and he fired back. Three-Finger Jack was struck in the chest. As he died, Jack spilled the beans on his accomplices, which would be the ultimate snitch move, but also so that I can tell you the story of our next segment, which is all about Bert Alvord, the reverse Batman. Ah yes, a prestigious and respected sheriff. Bert came from the West with his father, who was a justice of the peace. As a teen, he worked in corrals and stables and even witnessed the famous shootout and, 3 years later, the execution of John Heath. Bert became a deputy to John Slaughter in 1886 and spent 4 years helping him track down thieves and rustlers. He became particularly adept at ferreting out information concerning the whereabouts of various fugitives, reportedly playing a drunk man like a fiddle. Alvord drifts into Mexico in the mid-1890s, rustling cattle, before becoming a law constable in Fairbank and then Wilcox, Arizona. It's here he becomes the Batman. Using his position and seeing the prosperity of criminals for so long, he masterminded a band of the best train robbers he'd ever met. Even after arrests in 1900 and 1903, Alvord and Billy Stiles, his deputy and accomplice, managed to escape a capture. When he collects a bounty too high to ever go unnoticed as a lawman again, shout out to Three-Finger Jack above, Alvord spreads a rumor of he and Billy's deaths, even sending 2 coffins to the town of Tombstone. The scheme naturally didn't work, the coffins were literally empty. So Alvord is recaptured in 1904, but after 2 years in prison at Yuma, he was released and went to Latin America. He reportedly turned up in Venezuela and in Panama as a canal worker. Supposedly he died around 1910. The worst alias in the West award goes to Big Steve. Why? Because his name was Steve Long. Like if he'd been tall and skinny, would they have called him Long Steve? No creativity, these Westerners. No debate though, Big Steve was big. He was a whopping 6'6" and rumored to be 3 feet wide in the shoulders alone. His background is very obscure to us, but this northerner established himself as a vicious gunman and La Marie. In 1867, he obtained the deputy marshal position and had a series of bloody gun duels within the first month. This grabs the attention of the Moyer brothers, who had founded the town and appointed themselves the justice of the peace and marshal respectively. 6 pistols, 1 in each hand, the trio dished out justice in the back room of the town saloon, ordering ranchers to sign over their deeds to their lands and miners to hand over their claims. Anyone who refused them was killed, and between that and the crooked card games, that saloon became known as the Bucket of Blood. Meanwhile, a local rancher was beginning to form a vigilante group to put the trio out of business. One night, after moonlighting as a thief, Long is injured by one of his intended victims. His fiancée is dressing the wound when Long confides in her how he got it. She's disgusted and tells the vigilante group about his attempted robbery. Don't trust no well anyways. The Bucket of Blood was stormed shortly after. On October 28, 1868, the vigilantes proceeded to hang the men, but not before Long made an unusual request to have his boots removed. Why? His last words were, "My mother always said that I'd die with my shoes on." Girl boss alert, let's talk about Miss Calamity Jane. Now that is a cool alias, and a definite upgrade from her original name of Martha Jane Canary, born in Missouri around 1856. By the time she's a 18, Jane's sharpshooting was the talk of the town, and she was the head of her orphaned household. Said to be a whiskey-drinking, gun-tootin' type of gal, she once even spat tobacco at the main actress of a play who is said to have done a terrible role. Jane worked hard and fought harder. She earned her nickname Calamity Jane when she rescued an army captain from his camp being attacked by indigenous clans. She's reported to have saved the lives of 6 stagecoach passengers in 1876 when they were attacked by bandits, and she even nursed people back to health during the Deadwood smallpox outbreak while cussing them out, of course. Having the reputation for being able to handle a horse better than most men and shoot like a cowboy, her skills took her into Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1895, where she performed sharpshooting astride her horse. Jane's struggle with alcoholism lost her this job, and then her following one at a newspaper. Finally, Jane returns to Deadwood, where she was recovering and tired. She works in a caring for the girls, doing their laundry and cooking until she passes. Though she married a man named Burke at the age 33, when Jane died in 1903, she asked to be buried next to Wild Bill Hickok. Rumor has it that Hickok was the only man she ever loved, and her wish was granted. The funeral was the largest ever held in Deadwood for a woman, and Calamity's coffin was closed by a man who, as a boy, she had nursed back to health when the smallpox epidemic took so many lives in Deadwood. His 2 passions in life were his mama and hardcore crime, Thomas Hodges and the Tom Bell Gang. He even started off as a doctor, all the makings of what your mama would want for you. Well, with the exception of crime, but hey, it pays money, so you know. Thomas started as a medical orderly in the Mexican War. He moved to Nashville to start his practice afterwards. Doctor life got boring, and when the gold rush was tempting, he set off to California, where he failed tremendously at prospecting, so just to become a thief, I guess, under the alias Tom Bell. He has an arrest in 1855, but escapes because I guess jails were unlocked buildings or something back then. He escapes with notorious criminal named Bill Gristy, a known thief and arsonist, and a few others. With their help, Hodges formed the Tom Bell Gang and began to prey regularly upon the gold rush area. Their fumble was killing a woman in an unsuccessful robbery attempt, and the gang was tenaciously pursued through the 1856 until Gristy was captured and spilled the beans. Before that, there were violent escapes from the clutches of justice, but because Grizzly's information, Hodges was finally captured by a posse near the Merced River. He wrote letters to his mother and Elizabeth Hood, his mistress and partner in crime, before his execution in 1856. Let's channel some Bonnie and Clyde energy by talking about Jim Reed. Good old Jim was born 8 miles from the Missouri hamlet to a relatively wealthy family. At 17, he moved to Carthage, where he had his first encounter with Myra Bell Shirley. The youths courted, but she was a few years younger, and her father disapproved because of it, leading Reed to quite literally have a gun duel with Myra's father. Reed is forced to leave and takes advantage of the newly started Civil War to join a guerrilla raiders group, where he got a taste for lawless and reckless abandon after a life of spoils. After the war, he continues his reckless abandon. He killed 2 men in Missouri and fled to Dallas, and once again ran into Myra, whose family had moved there after he had, well, killed her dad. They became lovers once more, seeing as she already had a daughter from a past man who really cared about what happened to her reputation now. The two take her daughter and move and have another child together. This family of 4 pulls holdups around the state together for a few months before returning to Texas to buy a farm with their murder money. They could have left there, put the crime behind them, but instead Reed, Myra, and 2 other thieves break into the cabin of Creek Indian chief Watt Grayson. He handled the government subsidies for the tribe, and Reed gang tragically tortured the chief until he tells them where they can find the rumored $30,000. For this and a variety of other misdeeds, Reed soon was hotly pressed by the law, and he was forced to leave Myra behind. His bounty grows and grows as he loses control, and within a few months, a close acquaintance kills Reed for the bounty on his head. Let's follow that famous name up with another, Nat Love. He, like Geronimo in the next segment, is an exemplary historical figure that most people either haven't heard of or they don't know much of his story. Born on a plantation in 1854 Tennessee, Nat fought past the difficulties and challenges of obtaining an education while enslaved, and learned how to read and write as a child with the help of his father and literate people around him. Slavery came to a thankful end, but the strings attached meant that, like many others, Nat's parents stayed on the Love plantation and worked as sharecroppers. Teenage Nat worked in the stables and gained a reputation as a gifted horse breaker. He sold his own beloved horse to hit the big city Dodge, Kansas at age 16. Working on ranches as a literal cowboy and cattle driver, he lived an eventful life, having run into cattle rustlers, enduring inclement weather, had his horse shot out from beneath him, and even met the likes of Pat Matterson and Billy the Kid. Honing his skills on the range, he became an expert marksman and cowboy, and chose to test his abilities in the Deadwood Rodeo of 1876. 1986. He won the $200 prize money and prevailed in 2 shooting contests as well. It's a successful lassoing in a bronco ride that earned him the nickname Deadwood Dick, which is hard as but in 1877, he has a unique cultural run-in when a band of Pima natives capture him while he's rounding up stray cattle that happen to wander onto their territories. The Pimas had injured Love when he tried to escape their capture, but instead of ending his life, they chose to nurse him back to health out of respect for his African American heritage and the plight of his people, which they considered completely uninvolved in their battle against the government. Good old Love got better and took off on one of the Pima's fastest horses, traveling over 100 miles bareback right into the arms of Alice Love, whom he chose to marry in 1889 and abandon the cowboy life for good. He died in 1921 at the age of 67 and wrote a memoir in 1907 you can still read today. The name that inspired many Western flicks, whether old or new, is Geronimo. Unfortunately, most adaptations are incredibly offensive and inaccurate, and a lot of people don't actually know anything about the man and what may be the biggest scandal of the West. So let's learn. Born Goyacla, his story begins when Geronimo began inciting countless raids against the US and Mexican armies after his wife and 3 children and mother were by Mexican troops in the mid-1850s. Wild with grief, it's during an Apache tradition of grieving that he hears the voice of an ancestor tell him, "No gun will ever kill you. I will take the bullets from the guns and I will guide your arrows." Well, Geronimo got his nickname for this exact reason. His ancestors' promise that no bullets could harm him appeared to be true as he continuously escapes law enforcement, Anglo-Americans, and Mexican troops. He's wounded multiple times, but he always recovers. He becomes a newspaper sensation. The more often Geronimo escaped and the longer he was able to disappear, the more embarrassed the US military and politicians grew by this scandal. After all, an indigenous chief and his clan were single-handedly stopping the entire government from infringing any further on their promised territory, going against everything the government smeared about the indigenous peoples at the time. Geronimo repeatedly evaded capture and life on reservation. In his famous final escape, a full quarter of the US standing army pursued him and his followers and still couldn't make it. When Geronimo was captured on September 4th of 1886, he was the last Native American leader to formally surrender to the US military. He spent the last 23 years of his life as a prisoner of war, paraded by the American government for approved trips to world fairs and Wild West shows like a display. He was even in attendance at President Theodore Roosevelt's inauguration, but Roosevelt refused Geronimo's plea to permit the Chickawawas to return to their native lands in the West. On his deathbed 3 years later, Geronimo reportedly told his nephew he regretted surrendering to the US. "I should have fought until I was the last man alive," he told him. Geronimo was buried at the Apache Indian Prisoners of War Cemetery in Fort Still, Oklahoma, but thankfully had his body returned to rightful land.
Starting off this list at our number 10 spot, we have Ivan IV, more commonly known as Ivan the Terrible. He was the son of Vasily III, who was the Rurikid ruler of the Grand Duchy of Moscow. After his father's death, however, at just 3 years old, Ivan was named the Grand Prince, and by the time he was 16, he was declared as the Tsar or Emperor of Russia, officially establishing the Tsardom of Russia. Ivan and his reign are certainly known for the transformation of Russia from a medieval state to an empire, but not without a huge cost to the people of Russia, as well as a hit to the long-term economy. Ivan has been described as being intelligent and devout, but also prone to paranoia, rage, and episodic outbreaks of mental instability that only increased the older he got. One of the main points of extreme violence and viciousness was the massacre of Novgorod, which saw the deaths of an estimated 2,000 to 15,000 people, as well as a shocking amount of acts of extreme, violent cruelty. In the later years, like I mentioned, his violent tendencies only got worse, which led to him doing things like striking his heir in the heat of an argument so badly that it left him with brain damage. In the end, Ivan the Terrible met his demise from a heart attack in 1584. Yeah, they say that impaling hundreds of people every day isn't great for the heart health. Someone should have let him know about vitamins and minerals, or maybe some good cardio-heavy exercise. I don't know. In our number 9 spot today, we have Leopold II. As the second king of the Belgians, Leopold has been said to be responsible for the deaths of somewhere between 2 to 15 million people. Yeah, million. It wasn't in Belgium that he committed his atrocious acts, however. It all started when he claimed himself to be the founder and sole owner of the Congo Free State, which was a private project he undertook on his own. Leopold loved colonialism. He wanted to colonize everything he possibly could, and this is why he started the International African Society, which he used to travel to Africa, claim land that obviously wasn't his, and we're not talking about a small piece, we're talking about land that is several times the size of Belgium, and many countries just let him do this and allowed him to freely rule this land. This is definitely already bad enough, but of course things only got worse. Leopold had his own private militia that he used to force the indigenous population into hard labor. While Leopold was doing this, of course, for economic reasons, he also was just doing this because he was a messed up guy. He was terrible. He made those who lived here harvest and process rubber, and the punishments for those who didn't harvest enough for him were extremely severe. Not to mention, it is also said that sometimes he would just inflict harm because he could. Eventually, a stop needed to be put to his wrongdoings, but of course he was going to do everything he could to hide some of the horrors he did. The entire archive of the Congo Free State was burned, and he told his aide that even though the Congo had been taken from him, quote, "they have no right to know what I did there." The Congo was taken from him but remained under the rule of Belgium in 1908 until the Congo was given independence in 1960. As for Leopold, well, he remained the ruler of Belgium until his death in 1909, but the secret was out now and no one liked him. In fact, his funeral procession was booed by the crowd because everyone was angry at him for the things that he had done. In our number 8 spot today, we have Qin Shi Huang. While this leader is often credited with creating the first unified Chinese empire, the Qin dynasty, these accomplishments didn't come cheap. When he came to power in 221 BCE, he strictly followed 7 principles which not only pushed for severe punishment, but also acted in contraries and issued unattainable orders. He also is said to have been extremely paranoid about the power of the educated, which led to him burning books so that no one could ever learn what was in them, and he also killed 460 Confucian scholars in just 1 year, which some claim was because they were unable to make him immortal. Huang wanted not only to establish a transport system, but also build a wall to keep out enemies, and this meant that he had to relocate at least 120,000 families. He declared that all would be equal under one law, and then taxed everyone heavily, and because of these heavy taxes as well as the insane labor that was expected to create the wall and the transport system, thousands of people were overworked, starved, and perished. He also had laborers create a massive tomb for him, complete with 8,000 life-size terracotta warriors and horses, which you may be familiar with because now it is rumored to be an extremely haunted place. I mean, an evil ruler's resting place? Yeah, of course it's haunted. In our number 7 spot today, we have Don Carlos. I'll be honest, this little troublemaker never made it to the title of king, but he sure was a little too close for comfort when you hear about the kind of things he was doing. Carlos was the Prince of Asturias during the mid-1500s, as he was the eldest son of King Philip II of Spain. It is said that Carlos may have had some troubles right from birth, which many believe could be due to the inbreeding that was common in the family at the time. Descriptions of his behaviors, though, are far worse than what anyone could have expected. It is said that Carlos did horrible things like hurting or taking the lives of animals just for fun. I mean, nowadays we call that a huge warning sign for potential killers. Back then they just chalked it up to boys being boys. It is even said that at one point he purposefully blinded all of the horses in the royal stable. Red flags, they were abundant. Soon, of course, his cruelties would extend to humans, with people claiming that one time he chose to whip a servant girl for no reason other than because he could. And apparently one time he made a shoemaker eat a pair of shoes that he had made the prince that he didn't like. He was just a little twerp. Carlos was set up by his family to marry the eldest daughter of King Henry II, but after a few hours with the man, she decided there's no way in hell. Like, he was so bad, she would rather marry his dad, which she did in 1560. In the end, Carlos was found to be plotting to take out his own father, which landed him in prison in solitary confinement, where he passed away 6 months later. In our number 6 spot today, we have King Charles VI. King Charles VI started off his reign by being very well loved and respected, but as time went on over his 4 decades of ruling, he ended up being known as Charles the Mad. His erratic behavior had him hacking up knights, imagining that he was St. George, and he would also have bouts of amnesia where he would be able to recognize some people but not his wife and children. This is all very strange and of course quite sad, as he was obviously exhibiting signs of extreme mental illness, but one of the strangest symptoms was him believing that he was made of glass. He was terribly frightened of falling or being jostled too hard, and he would actually insert iron rods into his clothing to try and keep himself from shattering. But then he would also apparently run wild at top speeds throughout the halls of the castle or the streets, which would obviously mean that he was totally abandoning his fear of fragility. It apparently got so bad that he had to be held inside with the entrances bricked up. Sadly, he continued on this path until he passed away in 1422. In our number 5 spot today, we have Nero. For this one, we are going to be taking it all the way back to the age of the Roman Empire. When we think back to these times, they weren't necessarily the most kind, peaceful times, but there certainly are some characters that stand out as being particularly brutal, and one of those is Nero. Throughout his reign, he wreaked havoc on the Roman Empire. He burned cities, he killed thousands of people, including every member of his own family, and I mean, we know the inventive execution methods of the past, so you can probably guess at just how brutal all of these were. Most Roman sources give us an almost completely negative review of him in reference to both his personality as well as his reign as a leader. He was called compulsive and corrupt, and it is believed that he is actually to blame for the great fire that burned Rome, but instead he used the Christians as a scapegoat so that they would receive punishments rather than him. In the end, after being declared a public enemy by the Roman Senate and realizing that the rebellion would be lost, he ended up taking his own life at the age of 30. In our number 4 spot today, we have Pol Pot. Pol Pot was the leader of the Cambodian revolutionary group called the Khmer Rouge, and this group, with him at the forefront, went on to try and destroy the Cambodian civilization. This wasn't necessarily how the group started out, but once Paul and others who shared his ideals came to lead it, things quickly became very dark. He is likely one of the only people who ordered a mass genocide in his own country. The reasoning behind all of this is because he believed that destroying the civilization was the best way to start a new regime and bring in a new age. He ended up serving as the prime minister from 1976 until 1979, during which his policies led to the deaths of around 2 million people, which is horrifying. That was about 25% of the entire population. He even liked to keep the skulls of those he had killed. Just gonna say, it seems as though politics was the mask for someone who just really wanted to kill people. There are so many horrific details surrounding him and the things he did, much of which I can't even repeat here on YouTube, and that is exactly how he landed a spot here on today's list. He truly did some horrendous things, and in the end went on to live the rest of his life and died of natural causes before he could even answer for any of his crimes, which is just the most frustrating end to a horrible tale. In our number 3 spot today, we have Maximilien Robespierre. Okay, I'll be honest. This is quite a polarizing one. Maximilian, on one hand, was great. He advocated for universal suffrage, for unrestricted admission to national posts, and he was against racial and religious discrimination. Especially in the time he ruled in, this was huge. Of course people were against him, but in our modern views, he was way ahead of his time in these beliefs. On the other hand, however, he was extremely violent and was the leader during most of the French reign of terror that happened during the Revolution. It is said that during this time he was responsible for imprisoning somewhere around 300,000 and killing somewhere around 40,000. During the Revolution in 1793, he was elected head of the Committee of Public Safety, and from that point on, any voice that was in opposition to the change that was happening was struck down and silenced by him. Throughout the years, his ego and power only grew, which led to him being a little too quick to use the guillotine, his favorite execution method. He was getting a little too cozy with that thing, so much so that he began to use it even on people who had, at one time, been his allies. We saw this clearly when it came to the execution of George Danton, who Maximilian had executed after he suggested maybe chilling out on the whole reign of terror thing. In the end, people caught on to this tendency for violence and horrible punishments, which definitely lost some of his public support, and this was only exacerbated when it was realized that he now had beliefs that directly contradicted those he had earlier, like when he tried to create a national religion called the Cult of the Supreme Being. By the time 1794 came around, he was overthrown, and later that year he found himself being executed by, you guessed it, the guillotine. Not good. No thanks. In our number 2 spot today, we have Vlad Tepes. Often referred to as Vlad the Impaler, he was the ruler of Wallachia 3 times between 1448 until his death in 1476. He is often regarded as one of the most important rulers in Wallachian history, and to many he is a hero, and this is not to disregard that. But you don't get a nickname like the Impaler by being a passive, peaceful guy. Vlad was known for his brutality and his love love of impaling people, but it is also said that everyone's favorite vampire, Dracula, was modeled after him. This is because it is rumored that Vlad liked to dip his bread in the blood of his enemies before eating it. I prefer a little olive oil and balsamic vinegar with mine, but hey, to each his own, I guess. Vlad is known for his intimidation tactics, which included having bodies of those he had killed lined up outside of the city so that any enemies approaching would know what fate they had coming. Like I mentioned before, many regard Vlad as a hero. I mean, it is abundantly clear that he fought as hard as he could to protect Romania and Bulgaria from the Ottomans, but that doesn't mean that the horrific things he did have been forgotten either. Vlad definitely left quite the legacy behind when he was killed in 1476. In our number 1 spot today, we have Joseph Stalin. Stalin was a Georgian revolutionary and Soviet political leader who governed the Soviet Union from 1922 until his death in 1953. Despite the fact that he started his time governing the country as a part of a collective leadership, by the 1930s he had consolidated all of the power and went on to begin acting as the Soviet Union's dictator. During his reign, Stalin was responsible for the deaths of over 60 million people, 20 million of them being his own. Apparently the math works out to about 40,000 people per week, which is just unbelievable. For almost 30 years, he reigned the Soviet Union with terror and violence. I mean, his decisions led to a famine that killed millions of people. Also, the lives he took weren't just of his enemies. I mean, how could one person have 60 million enemies? He would take the lives of families of people he liked. He just took too many lives, was too paranoid, and while he was powerful and smart, he could also be an absolute monster. This is all perfectly summed up when he said, quote, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is simply a statistic."
Number 10. King Edward VIII. Directly after his father died in 1936, King Edward VIII took the throne, right? That's pretty normal. But the tides quickly turned when, less than a year later, he renounced his position. Now, this was of course a huge scandal right off the bat. This is not something that's taken lightly in the royal family. Turns out the woman responsible for stealing his heart was that of Wallis Simpson, America's socialite who had already been divorced once before and was at this point working through her second divorce. So you can only imagine how everybody reacted at that point, right? Oh, how dare she? His proposal to Simpson, of course, caused social and political backlash. The Church of England wasn't so chill with Edward marrying someone who had already been divorced. Yeah, they're not really okay with that. So Edward was forced to abdicate. Yeah, he had to, right, for love. Edward and Simpson then tied the knot in 1937, and they stayed together until Edward's death much later in 1972. Sliding into royal DMs right off the hop. Okay, we're in for a treat. Number 9, dark predictions. Of course, in recent years, the royal family has seen a change that many didn't really expect. When Harry and Meghan chose to renounce their royalty status, speculation began that this could be the beginning of the end for the monarchy. People only fueled their fire with questions, and also, somebody may have called it. Yeah, Nostradamus, he may have predicted this entire event. One of his predictions literally reads, "At the end of the war, the great powers change. Near the coast are born 3 beautiful children. They will ruin the town when they come of age, they will change the kingdom, and they will not see it grow anymore." Now, Harry is only one of 2 children, so I'm not sure if the, quote was talking about him and his siblings, or if it has more to do so with some other royal family members, but either way, there's some people who take Nostradamus' words very, very seriously out there, so I had to include it. Maybe there's something there, I don't know, maybe there's something we haven't quite broken down yet. That's why we need National Treasure 3, maybe this is the plot. Number 8, King Henry II. While we're on the topic of him, could Nostradamus have actually predicted the death of King Henry II? Because if he did, that's pretty curious, I'd say. Never used the word curious in my life, but I'm like, you know what, that's curious. King Henry II was actually a personal acquaintance of the prophet himself. That'd be kind of cool, being friends with Nostradamus. I'd be like, hey, how does Game of Thrones end? Please. While at one point in history, Nostradamus was seen addressing King Henry II as the most invincible King Henry of France, unfortunately Henry proved to be quite vincible when he met his gruesome death, might I add, at age 40. Yeah, in the summer of 1559, not a great time. A terrible jousting accident went wrong and it left the king passing away shortly after from sepsis. This is a terrible story, but I have to explain because, it's history and, well, that's what we're here for. The jousting accident saw the king having splinters driven into his eye and then his skull as well by one of his young soldiers. And the Nostradamus quote reads, "The young lion will overcome the older one. It says he will pierce his eyes through a golden cage." Okay, already we're a little bit spooky. "And that 2 wounds will ensure a cruel death." So I'm not saying he predicted it, I'm just saying, kind of nailed it. Number 7, a fateful turn of events. Queen Victoria, her reign began back in 1837 and it lasted until the Queen's death in 1901. Now at just age 18, Alexandrina Victoria had to rise up to the throne. Had to, right? All these cases, it's like, yeah, they have to do this. She was born, of course, on May 24th, 1819, and Queen Victoria was actually 5th in line when she was born, nowhere near the throne. So right off the bat, it was actually highly unlikely that she would ever see the crown. But one by one, all of her family members began passing away fast. In 4 years, 3 of Victoria's cousins passed away, and then her father and her grandfather both died 1 week apart from one another. So on one hand, obviously it's sad, it's tragic, everyone's dealing with loss so fast. But on the other hand, by the time 1830 rolled around, Victoria was only 11 years old, and already she was next up to bat for the throne at 11. Imagine, that's like some ancient Egypt. Number 6, the Great Irish Famine. The Great Irish Famine took out many people. Back in 1845, potato crop that a lot of the Irish population relied on were suddenly no longer available. See, a group of microorganisms wiped them out, and in result, around 1 million folks died or had to leave. Now, it was draconian law and British ruling at this point that made the exported food hard to reach people. That's where things stopped. This famine led to Irish independence, of course, and anti-union movements. And the show Victoria pulled back 0 punches in 2017, where an episode showed the true happenings behind the Great Irish Famine and the role that Queen Victoria played in coming to the aid of her then subjects. It was the death of at least 1 million people. This was a very dark 7 years in Irish history. Historian Christine Keneally spoke out and says, quote, "There is no evidence that she had any real compassion for the Irish people in any way." Yikes. That's a historian saying that. That's how you know. Number 5, Meghan Markle, solo strut. Okay, back in May 2018, we all set our alarms, we woke up early, and we all watched the royal wedding, right? We sipped our tea in our pajamas and we pretended like we were there, right? Just watching, along with the other billions of people online. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, his new Duchess. At the historic wedding, Thomas Markle was just a no-show. Yeah, Meghan just walked down that aisle by herself in front of 1 billion people watching at home or streaming it, and it was thought at the time that this was because of Thomas's health. See, right before the wedding, Thomas suffered a heart attack, right? Just days before. So of course nobody was upset. It was almost expected for him not to show up. But cut to a year later, we began talking again. Thomas and the Duchess are now not close, it seems. Thomas even spoke out against his own daughter at one point. There was a huge scandal where Meghan even spoke to Oprah, like Oprah and that big tell-all, and Meghan actually said to her father, "If you tell me the truth about working with paparazzi, we can help." And he wasn't able to do that, and for me, has really resonated, especially now as a mother, end quote. So yeah, they're not talking, I guess, anymore, which more than fair. If my dad was working with the paparazzi, showing them private letters, I'd be a little pissed too. There's no way though, the guy can't even unlock his email, let alone sending one? No way. Number 4, Prince Charles and Princess Diana's divorce. Prince Charles, the oldest son of the Queen, straight up admitted to having an affair with Camilla Parker before his divorce from his first wife, of course, Princess Diana. Imagine having this is crazy. A princess? You cheated on a princess? That's insane. So in turn, Princess Diana addressed the relationship and what's happening during, that famous 1995 interview with BBC. She couldn't have said it better, if I'm being honest. Diana said herself, quote, "Well, there's 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." Yeah, end quote. There's no better way of putting it, I think. It's a pretty baller way of saying it. I don't know. I haven't said baller in like 13 years, but I'm like, you know what? That's a baller move. It's pretty gangster. Diana also said she was in love with riding instructor Major James Hewitt during her marriage to Charles, so everybody was busy looking at their directions, it seems. Diana and Charles divorced in 1996, only 1 year before her tragic car accident. Now later in 2005, Charles ended up marrying Camilla. Has anyone seen Spencer? Kristen Stewart looked great in that movie, and now I want to watch it. Is it worth the watch? Let me know in the comments. I didn't see it go to theaters or anything. It kind of snuck by me while I was sleeping on all the good ones. Number 3, Prince Harry costume party. YouTube isn't a fan of some words, specifically one word that rhymes with Yahtzee, and it goes deep with history, as you could assume what I'm talking about. But with this being one of the biggest scandals, I have to bring it up, right? The Duke was always referred to as a bad boy, right? He was the bad royal, the bad boil royal. I don't know, I'm trying new shit here. But just how deep did these incidents cut? Well, before he settled down with Meghan in 2018, Harry had to issue a public apology back in 2005 because, whoops, somebody got photos from a costume party, and a few of them were in poor taste. Did the royal dress up as the Beast from Beauty and the Beast? No, he did not. Did he dress up like a witch? Like a little witch, maybe with a nice witch broom? No, none of that either. No, photos leaked of him wearing World War II German soldier gear. Yeah, I can't say too much, but it was even equipped with an armband, a very bad armband. Again, I can't say too much, nor will YouTube allow us to show too much, but you understand what I'm trying to say. You remember. It was poor taste. He could have dressed up in any way he wanted. He's a literal prince. And he does this? It's off-putting. Harry said afterwards, and I quote, "I am very sorry if I caused any offense or embarrassment to anyone. It was a poor choice of costume and I apologize." End quote. Nice. Right from the heart. That's good. Really goes deep with the royal history. We love it. Number 2, Vegas getaway. Nice. Roll those dice. It's one thing to party like a rock star, but to party like a prince? What does that even mean? I gotta keep this Prince Harry train going because, well, now I'm mad at him, but there's even more photos from history that show what was really going down in the royal family, His priorities, dare I say. After that party incident, just 7 years later, scandalous photos emerged from Harry's Las Vegas trip. Yeah, I had a little boys' night, it seems. It turns out what happens in Vegas may just leak online for your entire family to see, and your grandmother. That's probably not a great time. These scandalous pics were taken during a strip pool game. Lovely, we like that. Make sure you call the right pocket while you're not wearing any. The scandal actually prompted St. James Palace to contact the Press Complaints Commission before the snaps even made their way to British tabloids. Yeah, they knew right off the bat they were fucked. They're like, can we call them? Can we send a pigeon? What's the fastest? And finally, number 1, Boy Jones and other attempts. Okay, being the queen and all in history, a security team is always needed, obviously. And during her reign, specifically Queen Victoria, there were multiple attempts to harm the young queen. First attack was in 1840. It was an 18-year-old man named Edward Oxford, and he fired towards the Queen's carriage. When Edward was accused of high treason, of course, afterwards, he was actually found not guilty due to, you guessed it, insanity. A couple years later, in 1842, it happened again. This time, 2 men fired at her, both also missed. In 1849, her carriage was attacked by William Hamilton. In 1850, as the carriage was passing the gates of Buckingham Palace, Robert Pate, a retired soldier, might I add, ran up and hit her with his cane. Victoria was okay, luckily, but of course she was shook. Then these incidents kept occurring again in 1842, 1849, and 1872. Attempt after attempt after attempt. But then things got a little worse and, dare I say, a little bit more weird. If you haven't heard of Boy Jones or anything that happened there, I saved it for last because it's so horribly creepy. A teenager stalked the Queen back in 1838 until 1841, and his name was Edward Jones. Edward Boy Jones. This guy somehow managed to break into Buckingham Palace more than once, right? Before Assassin's Creed came out, no idea how we thought of this. Guy just knows a route in, and he would break in and would hide under the Queen's sofa. That was his go-to spot. Or he would sometimes just sit on her throne. And one of the worst things ever, sometimes he would go through her drawers. He would go through the Queen's drawers. That's so gross. What? Like that's gross. He would steal her clothes until eventually and thankfully he got caught.